What's up, gamers? Welcome back to 180 MTG. My name is Ryan Overturf, and today I want to talk about the Saviors of Kamigawa Prerelease. Not for the full podcast, but that is where I want to start. Saviors of Kamigawa, released in 2005, so just over 20 years ago, was the pre-release for the set. It was the second pre-release that I ever played. I promise you this is going somewhere. The first pre-release I played was the previous set, Betrayers of Kamigawa. I actually really enjoyed the first Kamigawa block when it came out. The set certainly has glaring aesthetic and mechanical issues. The only way they were able to do Kamigawa Neon Dynasty, it both involved a lot of time passing to forget about some rough mechanical execution. It also involved Wizards hiring some number of cultural consultants to get that stuff right. Some pretty glaring issues with original Kamigawa, but there were a lot of cards that were pretty fun game pieces, a lot of beautiful art. We were coming off the back of original Mirrodin block, which was totally busted. I was pretty new to the game. I started playing in 2003. Mirrodin was tough for me as a kitchen table player who wanted to build creative things because the only thing Mirrodin incentivized was playing the cheapest and most powerful artifacts. Kamigawa, despite having some really rough mechanics, a lot of cards that were barely interesting, barely playable, even in retail limited, did give you more space to explore. And over the years, I think actually Commander shined kind of light on Kamigawa and showed off what was cool about this set. A lot of cards have become kind of beloved in retrospect. But enough waxing about Kamigawa. Let's get to the pre-release. I need to set the scene a little bit more about just the year 2005. This was my sophomore year in high school, so I was still living at home. I did not own a cell phone, and actually the first iPhone released in 2007, so nobody had a smartphone. So I didn't have any phone, certainly not a computer in my pocket. And at home, very importantly, we still had dial-up internet, so accessing the phone for everybody in my family, a family of 6, used the same line that accessing the internet for any of us would. So people are way less on the internet back then, certainly if you still had dial-up at home. And that matters because it's time consuming to dial into the internet and look at all of the card previews before you go to the pre-release. So I went in relatively cold. I didn't know most or maybe even any of the cards from Saviors before playing the pre-release. And so I roll up, open up my sealed deck, put something together that I'm pretty happy with. I'm playing a match and it's game 3 and my opponent is behind. I think I'm leading him like 17 to whatever his life total was. He was dead next turn. If I just attack with my creatures, I still have cards in hand. It looks really good for me. My opponent makes this really weird attack. And I sit there for a minute thinking about what can happen. Think about maybe lining up blocks. Could there be some kind of pump spell? Maybe there's a spell that pumps multiple creatures, and if I make a block here, I could end up losing multiple of my creatures and not having a lethal attack on the way back. I just don't know what is really possible. I'm at 17, so I'm feeling good about not just losing. I end up declaring no blocks. I take 7 damage in combat. I go to 10. I feel fine. My opponent taps 4 mana. He puts a red card on the table and gestures at me. That card is Hidetsugu's second Rite. I lose the game. In case you're unfamiliar, Hidetsugu's second Rite is a 4-mana instant that says if target player has exactly 10 life, Hidetsugu's second Rite deals 10 damage to that player. I had no idea that a card like this, it could exist, that it did exist at all. And I was so mad. I remember because going to the pre-release, it was a big deal. I get to play with new cards, and I really want to win booster packs so I can open more of the new cards. And if I just knew this card existed, how could I possibly lose to it? And I was furious. And I'm still thinking about it 20 years later. I'm not upset about it anymore. I now appreciate the moment for what it was, and that's just such a cool story from my opponent. I hope that somewhere he's out there also thinking about this exact game, the time that he won with Hidetsugu's second Rite at the Saviors of Kamigawa pre-release. That is awesome, from a position of just not possibly being able to win a normal game of Magic. That is so cool, and it has stuck with me. And for all of Kamigawa's flaws, for all of Saviors of Kamigawa, the worst of the three original Kamigawa set's flaws, there's still some good bones there, and there's stuff I want to unpack about Hidetsugu's second Rite. So the real topic of today's podcast, I want to talk about stealing games and setting players up to steal games in cube design. First, I want to say and make clear that when I talk about stealing games, I'm not trying to imply that anybody deserves to win any kind of game and there's anything untoward happening, that you're stealing games like it's a crime. If stealing games is a crime, it's a cool crime. I'm talking about stealing games kind of in the same space as stealing bases in baseball, where it's something that does take some skill. It's something that you're rewarded for doing something a little bit unusual, a little bit risky, and you can come ahead in the game. It's fully within the rules, but because it is so unique and requires particular skills that are generally not part of a usual game, it gets kind of its own cool aesthetic label as stealing. In order to explain what I think is positive about having some aspect of stealing games in a cube experience, or really in any Magic format, I'm going to have to borrow and define another sports term real quick, and that is garbage time. This is something that you would often hear Cedric Phillips and Patrick Sullivan reference as games kind of got long and they weren't really going anywhere. Even if you don't know the term, you certainly feel it as a caster. It comes up less as a player, and even as a viewer of tournaments. When the games are bad, you can just change the channel. But as a caster, you have to live garbage time. And what garbage time is in sports, it refers to in a sporting event with a time restriction, like you're not trying to achieve a particular goal, you just have to have the most points at the end of regulation time. Garbage time refers to games where one team pulls so far ahead, it is such a blowout that it is unrealistic or even impossible for the other team to score enough points in regulation time to win the game. The game becomes fully uncompetitive, and garbage time, in the more literal reference in sports, it tends to involve second stringers taking the field. The starters are no longer playing for risk of injury. The game gets silly and weird because it really, at this point, has become a formality. Now, as a player who is active in your games, you don't always have to encounter garbage time because the rules of Magic allow you to concede whenever you want. We're not playing in regulation time. We have very clear goals that we're trying to achieve. But even still, there's lots of reasons that games of Magic, competitive or casual, enter garbage time. We have all been party to the game at Cube Night where somebody is way behind and they continue to play the game. Maybe they don't realize they don't have any outs. Maybe they don't realize how far behind they are. Maybe they just kind of forgot what's in their deck. Maybe there is some hope about the opponent making some number of mistakes. But even though the game is technically already over, it hasn't yet concluded. The opponent hasn't achieved their goal. So you play like 6-7 more turns of nothing happening and everybody else just has to watch. Those turns where the game is continuing but not going anywhere, that's garbage time. And I'm not talking about this to disparage anybody for continuing these games. A point that I do think is important for me to make today is that Magic is so complicated, it is not always clear when the game is over, and there's really high-profile examples of this. I'm going to reference, and I'll link to the show notes, a video by Ristic Studies that I think is a really great case study here, and that video is the Zugzwang machine. It's his video about lantern control in Modern. If you're not familiar, I recommend you watch the video. It's a great piece of Magic history. And I'll just give the cliff notes here. So Lantern Control is what they call a prison deck. It's a deck that's trying to stop your opponent from being able to play the game. The deck accomplishes with a Searing Bridge, which is an artifact that stops players from being able to attack with the creatures. You use a card called Lantern of Insight. That's the namesake card that causes players to play with the top card of their library revealed. And it played a number of cards that milled your opponent one card at a time. So once you stop anything on the battlefield from mattering, creatures can't attack, cards in hand don't seem to matter because you have fully stopped your opponent from advancing their game plan. You can just see the top card of the deck, and if it's a good draw, you mill it. Otherwise, you let them continue to top deck their lands and just do nothing for the rest of the game. Now, the reason I'm talking about this deck, and this video has exactly what I'm talking about, there's a moment in the finals of the Pro Tour. Matches of Magic rarely get higher stakes than this. It's Jerry Thompson on Mardu Pyromancer against Luis Salvato on Lantern Control. Jerry finds himself in a game where technically the gameplay will continue until the Lantern player mills out his entire deck. He has to draw from an empty library and he loses. However, the game has reached a point where none of his cards in hand are on the battlefield to do anything, and he is tremendously unlikely, over 99%, to not ever be able to draw a meaningful card again. And so he kind of walks through what's going on the battlefield. So Salvato has a Lantern of Insight, multiple mill effects, and Jerry is clearly communicating to the table spotter, and he asks, so I can concede and people will understand that I can't win, right? Like he's saying, okay, the booth, the broadcast team is going to be able to communicate that this game is over and I'm not prematurely conceding. That's how complicated Magic is. Like this is a deck that when it was first showing up, players would continue to play to no outs for a long time. And even when this deck was established, this deck was on its way to winning the Pro Tour. It's in the finals of the Pro Tour, and Jerry is still saying, okay, well, like people like get that the game is over, right? And that's an extreme example, but I'm just saying that even at the highest levels of competition, there are things that happen in Magic where it's not always super clear that the game is over. And so you want to show some grace to players that are playing games, and you do got to see it in action. Like that deck, like you can be explained that the game is over, but there's still a part of you that wants to fight, right? You know, a lot of players, you got the heart of the warrior or whatever, you want to keep going, but some games are just over, and it's very common that players continue to play games that are just over. That's an extreme example, but because of the high profile nature of it, I think that it's worth just pointing out that there's just going to be games where players just don't know that the game is over. And that's fine. That's just going to happen. And then I also want to point out that in Limited, Cube being a form of Limited, you are less likely to know what your opponent's deck's output is. It's not like a constructed deck that you can play against time and again. And you're less likely to know what your own deck's output is, either just because you have a combination that you never had before, which happens basically every time you draft. Your deck's going to be at least a little bit different. You might forget what's in your deck. You might, have outs that you just don't know of. You don't need to require players to know everything their deck is capable of doing. People are going to continue to play their games. That is fine. I'm not trying to disparage anybody who continues to play in garbage time, but I do just want to point out that it happens, why it happens, and why it's good to be aware of in cube design. So my emphasis here today is that this is something that's going to happen. It's nobody's fault. It's just going to happen, but we can design in ways that allows games to be taken over and won, even though they might feel like they're in garbage time. So that's what I'm getting at with Hidetsugu's second Rite. In that initial story at the Saviors of Kamigawa Prerelease, I was playing a game where I thought that I could not possibly lose, and just the existence of this card allowed my opponents to win. And that's what I am trying to talk about. This is something that I reflect in my cube designs today. So now that I've kind of talked about stealing games and garbage time and why we want to enable this, let's kind of get into more particular stuff in cube design. It's probably worth pointing out first that Hidetsugu's second Rite is not itself a great cube card. I think an important part of that pre-release experience is that I had no idea that the card existed. If you just toss this as a singular card in the cube, it's not going to come up that often. If it's on players' radar, like how likely are you to win with it? It's still interesting. It's not like a total zero, except in practice it is either a zero or a card that wins the game. So in that way, I guess it is a zero. And to be fair, there is space to explore with Hidetsugu's second Rite in cube. You can put in lands like Grove of the Burn Willows and other ways to make your opponent gain a little bit of life. So if they fall below 10, you can knock them back up to get them to 10 again. There's a lot of ways to deal smaller increments of damage and kind of build your deck around it a little bit. But for the most part, I do just want to talk about things that broadly are going to be able to show up in cubes without that much effort, that you can just play and that will not necessarily be fully on players' radar, at least not in terms of like a very specific card and a very specific thing happening. I think if you want stealing games to be meaningful, it has to be something that is not exactly what every game is going to be about. So let's talk a little bit about what happens in the early game that ends up in garbage time. Magic is an inherently synergistic game. A lot of cube design is really focused on making certain synergies shine and cards come together and produce something greater than the sum of their parts. And where you kind of end up in garbage time inherently in this space is that one player's engine is just working and the other player's is not. I have my A-B synergies going on. My creatures are now just on the battlefield with more power and toughness than you can realistically generate in one turn. Maybe I control like multiple planeswalkers. I have multiple enchantments as part of an engine. Like I have something that's drawing cards turn over turn. There's a lot of different ways to have a snowballing advantage on the battlefield. And when you're executing specific synergies and you just are so far ahead, then your opponent's just going to have less and less they can do to claw into the game. So one player pulls way ahead, that their synergies are working, the other players are not. And you can chalk this up as, hey, sometimes one player's deck works, one doesn't. But you can also understand that how this is the space where you get into games that have really concluded before they are functionally over. And to be clear, I'm not calling for reducing synergies or generally reducing the output of combinatorics in your cube. It is cool, it is fun, it is exciting to make your synergies come together to do powerful things. Rather, I want to look at what you can do, what can happen in a game of Magic when you are really far behind that still allows you to win. One option is sweepers. If you're worried about getting run over by a bunch of little creatures, you can have a card that destroys all creatures. Wrath of God, there you go. The issue with these is that sweepers tend to require their own balance on the way back. You kind of run into this risky space of turning the game into garbage time in the other direction. If all you're worried about is one player getting on the battlefield too quickly and winning with a lot of cheap creatures, Wrath of God will stop that from happening. However, you do still need to be mindful of how the creature deck can continue to play the game after all their creatures are destroyed. If you have like an artifact matters kind of archetype seated in your cube, and you are worried that you put in like, I don't know, Mox Opal, and you have this really efficient, strong artifact deck, you could put in Shatterstorm, 4 mana red sorcery, destroy all artifacts. That would stop you from losing when you resolve that card against the artifact deck. However, there is that risk that you were in garbage time in the other direction. Sweepers are a topic that really deserve their own entire conversation. There's also going to be aspects of specific cubes when you talk about adding a sweeper to that cube or how you want to have games continue after a sweeper resolves. There's a lot of granular stuff, a lot of nuance to that. But for the purpose of today's podcast, I want to focus more on ways to actually win the game. So sweepers are a useful tool for balance, but they're actually kind of more likely to put you in a garbage time space, not something that's really going to get you out of it. So going back to Hidetsugu's second Rite, it is an individual card, but what it represents, really more than anything, is just combo. Combo existing, game-winning combos being something that players have access to in your environment. My mind really goes to Splinter Twin when I think about the way that Hidetsugu's second Rite plays and what is appealing about it. You're playing a game, you could be tremendously far behind, you can have nothing going on, your opponent taps out, you flash in Pestermite or Deceiver Exarch, untap, play Splinter Twin or Kiki Jiki, and the game is just over. You have won. You have gone from few resources to completely winning the game. One thing about combo, though, is when you get really in the weeds, a lot of combo decks, that is just what the deck does. It's no longer really stealing a game with Splinter Twin if that's what you're trying to do every game and you are fighting for your spot to do it. It's just kind of what the game is about. Your opponent will be pretty keyed into it from the jump. Like the first game, you can steal one. What was fun about Hidetsugu's second Rite at the Saviors Prerelease was that it happened in Game 3 and I had no idea it was coming. I had no idea it was even possible. So there's room for combo. Combo does play into the space a little bit here, but when you talk about full-on combo decks, then it's more just that's what the game about. You're not really stealing it anymore. It's less exciting when it happens. It can still be fun. There's still plenty of room for that in Cube, but there's other tools that I do want to endorse over combo. And I also do want to point out that there are some combos that can put you in the opposite space, like similar to sweepers. There are combos that just put you in garbage time. An example of this, something that I have played with and have ultimately moved away from in all of my cubes, is Kitchen Finks combo. Some of those persist combos where you can sacrifice Kitchen Finks, put a +1/+1 counter on it, negating the -1/-1 counter from it persisting, keep bringing that back, gaining infinite life, an arbitrarily large amount of life, and then the game just continues. Like, you have a lot going on. Maybe you can close the game with that much difficulty, But anytime that combo happens and players are like, okay, I guess we do a library count and we play on from here, like you're mostly just in garbage time. The game is kind of decided, even though there might be some hidden information, maybe cards in order in the decks matters from here. There's stuff that can still happen, but for the most part, there's a game that is continuing past the point where it should reasonably conclude. So I'm a much bigger fan of murderous red cap in those combos, things that actually end the game immediately. Like, you can make an argument that you don't want a combo to just end the game, but how much game is still left to be played after you gain an arbitrarily large amount in life? It's just space that I think is pretty fraught that I have become much less interested in personally. So let's get into ways to steal games and to break out of garbage time that I do wholeheartedly endorse. One of them is just to have high impact individual cards. Notably, I'm not talking about power level outliers. Like, it is the case that something in the cube is just going to be stronger than other things, but things that are mindful of the mana curve. This is just an aspect of my original recipe Tubert design. Every color gets one 6 mana card, and those cards are just way more impactful than cheaper cards, just by nature of being mindful of the mana curve and having cards that have power levels that make sense next to each other. The 6 mana card is just going to be more high impact than any of the 1, 2s, and 3s, like multiple 1s, 2s, and 3s are what you're going to need to solve a 6. Not until you get to 4 mana, the cards even become remotely comparable. The 6 mana stuff is just designed to be high impact. If I fall behind, you have 2 or 3 creatures to my 0. I'm untapping, like maybe your creatures are even good, and I draw and I cast Grave Titan. Now we're playing a game again. Like, I'm up against it. You had a big advantage going into this turn, but now I have 3 blockers, one of which is gigantic, and that threatens to snowball the advantage back in my direction. Elspeth's Sun's Champion, very similar. You can have a giant creature, multiple giant creatures, multiple small creatures. Elspeth's +1 can make a bunch of chump blockers. Elspeth's -3 can answer any number of creatures with power 4 or greater. And importantly, with Elspeth and Grave Titan, they are very good at turning around and winning the game. They don't have the problem that sweepers have against synergistic packages, where now my opponent is just out of resources and eventually I'll win. These cards also threaten to win the game themselves. And it's also meaningful that they don't just deplete all of your opponent's material. If you have a couple of good attackers and I Grave Titan, it becomes a game. If we both just maintain our battlefields, something that Wrath of God, Shatterstorm don't allow you to do, that's just the opposite of what they do. Now there's tension. Do I attack? Do I try to turn the corner that way? Like, we're still playing a game. That's the virtue that I'm trying to extol when it comes to high impact individual cards. Things that impact the battlefield and make it so you retain your resources, but now the texture of the game has changed and it's going to be less clear who's even the aggressor. We're continuing to play. We're not in garbage time. In fact, the importance of our decisions has only heightened when these cards hit the table. You can be way behind before you play your 6th land and cast Overlord of the Boiler Bilges, and the effect of just doing 4 damage to something, and either that like goes upstairs, like that can steal a game that way. Well, I'm going to go more into that in just a little bit, or you just clean up the battlefield a little bit, and that one card can turn things around. And just having a high impact spell is really good to steal a game from a battlefield position where you are way behind. And there is an argument that those 6 drops, that's more of just a general catch-up mechanic than a way to outright steal a game, but I do try to have them at a power level where they are strong enough that these cards can just win the game on their own, which puts it into the territory where I think that they're a pretty important aspect of the conversation about stealing games. So I got a little bit ahead of myself talking about specifically Overlord of the Boiler Bilges, because the next thing I want to talk about is Reach. And I don't mean this creature can block creatures with flying as though it had flying. In general, when you hear me talk about Reach and Magic, what I'm referring to is ways to deal your opponent damage outside of combat. This is not going to be full-on combo, But things like permanence with death triggers, like Blood Artist, where whenever one of your creature dies, your opponent loses one life, which will enable you to deal your opponent damage outside of the normal constraints of a creature attacks and is unblocked and damages your opponent. Things like Lightning Bolt, just the fact that it can go upstairs. I am so biased in favor of red burn spells that can damage players, largely because maintaining some amount of outs where you can damage your opponent and they lose the game because you have lethal burn spells. Like, I'm talking about how cool conceptually Hidetsugu's second right is. I'm talking about stealing games. Of course, I love that. Fireball. In general, I find myself putting X damage effects in more and more of my cubes, or if I have a slot I'm not really sure what I'm doing with red, just some way to deal a ton of damage to a player that gives players something to think about. Like, you can pull way ahead, but if you're not focused on closing the game, you better watch out because this Banefire could just steal the whole game from you. I love that. These cards add so much tension just to playing the game by virtue of existing. They do things that are pretty normal. Like, I'm not talking about putting Lava Spike in the cube. I want Lightning Bolt because you will often use it to target a creature, but that modality that allows you to just say, hey, what are you at? And then suddenly the game is over. That's beautiful. That is clean stealing games. That's the stuff I live for. I mean, like, I play prowess in every constructed format. Of course, I'm going to love this. And this is something that I really like seeing in cube design. And I mean, I put like some flame slashes in. Sometimes you're like, okay, red needs to have an answer to a 4 toughness creature, whatever. There's reasons not to do all upstairs burn spells all the time. Like, sometimes you want spells that can only target creatures. But if there's no burn spells that go upstairs, that is just so not for me. That's something that I would generally not do in design. It's really important for me to have it so that you can just reach and end the game some amount of the time, because that leads to some of the most fun games to play, and it stops you from playing in garbage time. If you're in a position where you have burn spells that can only damage creatures and your opponent has pulled ahead, they have killed all your creatures, like, how are you ever going to close the game? And yeah, like, you're going to have games stolen from you some of the time, but it's so sweet when you get to do it and you want to enable players to do it. It is so fun to just steal games in that way. A mechanic that falls cleanly in the conversation about reach is haste. I love creatures with haste. They add a lot of texture just because spending a turn to cast a creature and waiting a turn to attack, your opponent gets so much more maneuverability around that. You can tap out freely if you don't expect your opponent to have something with haste. Sorcery speed removal is going to be an answer. If the creature has to be around for a turn, you can be more mindful about leaving up blockers. Just by existing, haste will cause a player on a low life total, even on an empty board, the opponent's got nothing going on, to think about leaving back a blocker or two, because you could just take a ton of damage from a haste creature. And in the space of just like fireballs and big burn spells going upstairs, I love the card Thundermaw Hellkite. 5 mana, 5/5, flying haste. When it enters, deals 1 damage to each other creatures with flying and taps those creatures. So there's a little bit more tension in this one than a fireball. It doesn't just win the game immediately. Some of the trade-off there is that if it doesn't end the game this turn, it's still just a 5/5 on the battlefield, but it has an ability that by either killing 1 toughness flyers or tapping anything larger than that, if you don't have a removal spell up at instant speed that you can cast, this thing's going to get in for 5 damage. Thundermaw Hellkite, in my mind, is kind of the poster boy for haste creatures that are good at stealing games. Just by existing, your opponent has to be mindful of your opponent having 5 mana, and that's the space I'm really talking about, because there's stuff like combo decks, like Hidetsugu's second right loses a lot of appeal just by players knowing that it exists. Without designing with it in mind, it's going to matter a lot less. It's going to have less opportunities to show up randomly and actually win the game. Full-on combo decks, if your opponent is only able to win with Splinter Twin, the games get a little bit scripted. Thundermaw Hellkite can just kill you. It can just be a 5/5. So it's an awesome tool. It's just a card that is just generally playable, that can just close the game and just steal the game, even if your opponent has multiple flying blockers, provided they have 5 or less life. Admittedly, Thunder by Hellkite is at a power level that's going to be pretty high as an individual card for a lot of cubes, but it does speak to something, kind of the last thing I want to talk about in terms of stealing games, and something that's been an aspect of my Spooky Cube for almost 10 years now, something that I have found important ever since I first constructed this cube, and has continued to be an aspect of the gameplay just for all of these years. It's never made its way out, is just making sure that there's some ways for creatures to be unblockable. So I talked about how Thunder My Hellkite is just kind of, it has abilities that line up that make it so the turn that you cast it, it's unblockable. But just having some creatures that can gain some unblockability. Evasion, of course, is great. Flying, trample, these are ways you can steal games. Like, those are kind of forms of reach if you have a creature your opponent can't block, or you have a giant trampler so they can't meaningfully block it. That's a way you can close the game, even if your opponent is texturally pretty far ahead. But outright unblockability is something that I've valued very high in Spooky Cube, just because the range of things your opponent can do. There's some really powerful synergistic packages here. There's ways to make a ton of reach blockers, like spider spawning and Ishkana Graph Widow are kind of fundamental aspects of what's going on in the cube. There's a lot of ways to gum up the battlefield. Gummed up battlefields lead you to games that are in garbage time. Nothing is happening. The game is not going anywhere. I have Ishkana. You have no good attacks. I'm going to activate it for 7 mana, a couple turns. The game eventually ends, but we all had to be here the whole time for it. So I make sure to have some creatures that are or can gain unblockability. And a big one, a card that I love in this cube, is Key to the City. Key to the City was originally printed in Kaladesh, the same set as Smuggler's Copter, and this is a cube that has discard matters as a heavily enforced theme, but Smuggler's Copter is just so much raw rate. That card is so powerful that I have always gone on the side of definitely wanting Key to the City in this cube, and anytime I have tried Smuggler's Copter, it's been on a short leash and hasn't made it more than one, maybe two drafts as I change the texture of the cube. But Key to the City, if you don't know the card, 2 mana artifact, tap it, discard a card, target creature can't be blocked this turn. And then also, when you untap it, you can pay 2 to draw a card. For the most part, though, Key to the City is a card that I kind of have married to Psychotog in this cube, where you can play these games where your opponent is generating massive value. They have a ton of blockers, but you can still have this out where if you get enough cards in hand, enough cards in your graveyard, you have other creatures, Wild Mongrel very much in the same space. You have some stuff that grows larger when you discard cards, Flameblade Adept. Now you have Marauding Mako, like some newer stuff in this space. And then Key to the City allows you to make one of them unblockable and actually make inroads towards closing or outright winning the game with any of them. You can top deck it on a game that's been about some attrition. Your opponent could be pulling ahead, but you still have this tool. Even though you have to attack and win, maybe it's a creature that does not natively have any evasion. Key to the City makes something unblockable, and it can just steal the game outright from there. And that's such an important aspect, even though there's so much happening in this cube where advantages are going to snowball, one player will pull very far ahead. Having that unblockability, even in an archetype where many of the creatures have no evasion, have no way to gain trample or flying or whatever on their own, and being able to make one of them unblockable is such a cool way to make it so that games are always in contention, so that the player with just giant creatures can, in some capacity, steal the game, even from a position of being pretty far behind on the battlefield. And I'm not trying to make an argument that Key to the City should be in more cubes, that it belongs in a lot of other cubes. It's a pretty specific thing, but it more loudly communicates what I'm trying to describe, just that texture of making it so that a game can be won more or less out of nowhere. A player can be very far behind texturally, and just having this game piece that can break that wide open. It's really similar to Rancor. This card is very commonly cubed. It's in a lot of my cubes, actually. 1 green mana aura, enchanted creature gets +2/+0 and trample. When Rancor goes to the graveyard, you return it to your hand. The thing about Rancor is in a lot of games, it doesn't really feel as much like stealing the game. It feels like you put Rancor in your creature and you just have good attacks. You often win in very short order, like you put it on a 1-drop, 2-drop, 3-drop, whatever, and you just have good attacks the entire game. It can show up late. It could show up in the same style of decks that I'm describing in like a Wild Mongrel deck, and can make a big attacker that attacks for a variable amount of damage. Could be a Even just putting it on a Tarmogoyf can be a huge deal in a lot of spots, and usually that's the case where the player playing Rancor is not the one stealing the game, they're the one presenting a position where the game has to be stolen from. Like, successfully resolving an aura on a creature is usually a pretty good sign that things are going well for you, but it does show up if you play enough games with Rancor and you have large creatures that have difficulty, have no evasion natively. It can certainly be used as a tool to steal game. But the reason I started with Key to the City is that it's a more clear and extreme example of what I'm talking about and the things I'm trying to incentivize here. This has been by no means an exhaustive list of all the ways a player can win a game of Magic from behind. I'm mostly just trying to provide some food for thought and shine some light on something that I think is pretty important in making a cube playable and replayable, is making it so that games rarely fully get away from a player and minimizing the amount of time that players spend in games that are already over. Giving players tools to come back from behind and to outright win the game out of nowhere will make it so the average game is just way more compelling. If a player earnestly believes that they can still win, I'm not talking about a player who's in garbage time and is drawing because they forgot what's in their deck. That's going to happen always. When they are pleasantly surprised, if they don't know how they can win and they draw that devil's play that deals X damage to their opponent, and they go, oh yeah, I have this, and they actually win the game, that's what's going to keep them coming back. The empty hope that maybe something nice will come off the top of the deck, I don't know what it is, that's not actually that fun. But actually having the draw step that wins you the game out of nowhere and stealing that game, that's what's going to keep people coming back. I'm going to close things out today with another story that came to mind when I was working on show notes for this week. When I was reflecting on that Saviors of Kamigawa pre-release, I remembered that first pre-release I played, the Betrayers of Kamigawa pre-release. At the Betrayers of Kamigawa pre-release, one of my opponents resolved Umezawa's Jite against me. All-time greatest, possibly the most powerful limited card ever printed. If there is a shortlist that's in contention, only very few cards even could be in the conversation to be as powerful as this card. I was, again, pretty new to Magic. I read it, and the design is so egregious that, yeah, even though this is my first time seeing the card, I'm pretty new to the game. Like, I read all the cards in my deck when I was building the deck. My opponent cast that, and he kind of laughed and he said, "I'm sorry." And I said, "What the hell is this?" And the game is over. The entire game is garbage time when your opponent is putting Umezawa's Jite on creatures and connecting, because they'll be able to kill all your creatures, they'll be able to pad their own life total, and they'll be able to accelerate the way that they close the game against you. So where Hidetsugu's second Rite is in ways a card that dreams are made of, something that allows for very exciting moments that allows players to steal games, Umezawa's Jite is a card that pushes players into garbage time for the entire game. I think that the ideal cube experience doesn't use cards that are very much like either card, cards as miserable that bog the game down as Umezawa's Jite, or cards that are so specific that only work in one context, like Hidetsugu's second Rite. But when I'm picking between one card or the other, I'm generally going to look for cards that are closer to Hidetsugu's second Rite than they are to Umezawa's Jite. Thank you for taking the time to listen today, for liking, commenting, reviewing, sharing, subscribing, whatever you do to support the podcast. I appreciate you all so much. And I will be back next week talking more Cube. Later, gamers.